Professor Ruth Vanita, and it will be chaired by Professor Harish Trivedi. The rapporteurs for this session are Sakshi, Dogra, and Bhavna Shrey. So without further ado, I'll just pass it on to Bhavna and Sakshi to introduce the chair.
Once again, a very warm welcome to everyone present here. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Harish Trivedi to set in motion the seventh session of our online international conference on language ideologies and the vernacular in South Asian colonial and post-colonial literatures and public spheres. Professor Harish Trivedi is former professor of English at the University of Delhi and was visiting professor at the universities of Chicago and London. He's the author of Colonial Transactions, English Literature in India, and has co-edited Kipling in India, India in Kipling 2021, Literature and Nation, Britain and India 1800 to 1990, 2001, and Postcolonial Translation Theory and Practice 1999. He has published essays on Kipling, Gandhi, Foster, and Rushdie, and edited a book in Hindi on the medieval poet Rahim in 2019. He's currently a contributing editor of a project based in Stockholm for writing a history of world literature. Welcome, Professor Trivedi. Over to you.
Thank you, Sakshi. I suppose the phrase to begin with is without much ado. Yeah. It's been used twice and I'll use it again. Very brief introduction to Ruth because she is already very famous. She has made a tremendous contribution internationally and people look up to her work, waiting for each new book of hers. The latest book of hers is, as it happens, a novel, her first novel, Memory of Light. Not many readers, it's been shortlisted for a prize. It's not surprising, this first novel is so well done in the late 18th century. It's about gender and sex, about same-sex relationship, love. But it also plays on her book of poems. She's also a published poem, The Play of Light. And this is The Memory of Light. The Play of Light was 1994. Her main contribution has been in the areas of, as I said, gender, sex, same-sex love, and what is not as well remembered perhaps because of the very nature of the business of translation, which is subsidiary, is that she has also published 7 volumes of translation at the last count. A whole variety of authors, mainly women, perhaps not even mainly women, but yes, many women too amongst them. What she is to speak to us about today is the matter of translation and reverse translation at that. She has stunning erudition, ranging across both East and West. And she is always original, sometimes to the point of being provocative. We shall today find out how it goes. Ruth, without further ado.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's a particular delight to be here with Harish in virtual space. He was my PhD supervisor and one of my gurus. This paper is a preliminary inquiry into a process that I am terming reverse translation. The process is this. First, philosophical terms from a Western lexicon are translated from a vernacular English into a classical language, Sanskrit, using non-equivalent philosophical terms. Second, these philosophical terms are translated back into the vernacular English, I'm calling, and acquire a new meaning in English. Finally, the new meaning of the Indian concept becomes its primary meaning in Indian languages, vernaculars such as Hindi or Marathi, and to some extent, even in the classical language, Sanskrit. Today, I'll examine 2 examples of how translation over a period of time changes the meaning of philosophical concepts. My first example is nastika. The word astik in Hindi has today, and Marathi and several other languages, has come to mean theist and nastik atheist. These, however, are the results of inaccurate reverse translation. Asti means is, and astika is one who says is, and a nastika is one who says is not. The Western term theist encompasses a belief both in a personal God and in the individual soul. And astika asserts the existence of something that is not matter. But this something need not be a personal God. There are 3 to 4 Astika schools of philosophy which do not posit a personal God. Sankhya was an extremely influential school of philosophy. Its concepts such as gunas, prakriti, etc. undergird the Gita. But Sankhya does not posit a personal God. According to Sankhya, each being is an independent consciousness. Consciousness is not the same as God or even soul. Mimamsa philosophers also argue that there is no need to posit God as creator. Early Nyaya philosophers wrote very little about God. Later Nyaya philosophers offer arguments both for and against God's existence. Vaisheshika philosophers are also divided on the matter. Yet all these 4 are considered Astika schools of thought. Some ancient Indian thinkers termed Nastika any school that did not accept the Vedas, including Buddhism, Jainism, Charvaka. But other thinkers contested this classification. Andrew Nicholson argues that Astika came to mean acceptance of the premises of Dharma. He shows, for example, that a Buddhist monk could be expelled from a monastery on grounds of being Nastika. So, what is the process by which Astika and Nastika come to mean theist and atheist? So, it begins with dictionaries. And I won't go into all the dictionaries, but just a few. Wilson's Sanskrit English Dictionary 1832 defines Nastika thus, and I quote, an atheist, but applied by the Orthodox Hindus to anyone who denies the divine authority of the Vedas or doubts the legends of the Purans. Nasti, there is not, in parenthesis, a god, etc. So notice the language here. First, he unequivocally states that Nastika means atheist. Then he modifies it, but applied by the Orthodox Hindus. So by implication, for unorthodox Hindus, Nastika means atheist, but Orthodox Hindus have twisted it to apply to what he calls the legends of the Purans. Now, Wilson doesn't cite any evidence for either of these assertions. 14 years later, Yeats's Sanskrit English Dictionary 1846 simply states Nastika and atheist. The process of reverse translation is complete with the original meanings erased. This process of reverse translation, which is implicit in Wilson, becomes explicit in Monia Williams's influential dictionaries. In his English Sanskrit Dictionary 1851, Monia Williams translates atheist into Sanskrit as Nastikaha, Devanindakaha, Anishwarvadi. Much better translation actually as Anishwarvadi. Next, in his 1872, first from English to Sanskrit, he translates atheist as Nastika. Next, in the 1872, his own Sanskrit English dictionary, he now performs a reverse translation, repeating and expanding Wilson's statements. I quote, Nastika, atheistical, unbelieving, infidel, and unbeliever, applied by the Orthodox Hindus to anyone who denies the divine authority of the Vedas and a future life, he adds that, or doubts the legends of the Puranas, unquote. 12 years later, Apte's Practical Sanskrit English Dictionary, 1884, reasserts this, but omits the reference to Puranic legends. Now he says, Nastika, quote, an atheist, unbeliever, one who denies the authority of the Vedas and a future life, or the existence of a supreme ruler or creator of the universe. He adds that, unquote. Apte acknowledges in his preface that he is greatly indebted to Monia Williams's dictionary. And then later dictionaries repeat, the Shabda Sagara Sanskrit English Dictionary 1900 reproduces Wilson's definition verbatim. Interestingly, Franz Bopp's 1847 Glossarium Sanskritum, which is a Sanskrit Latin dictionary, is somewhat more accurate. And I'll forgive my mispronunciations of Latin. Nastika, qui vitam futuram esse negat, qui brahmanaque religioni non addictus est. So it translates roughly as one who denies a future life and is not attached to the Brahman's religion. Bopp doesn't use the Latin word atheus, which means atheist, to translate Nastika. So this suggests that perhaps translating from one classical language to another may produce less distortion. Now let's take the example of Indian language. I'm going to take the example of Indian language translations of Bhagat Singh's essay, Why I Am an Atheist. These translations are certainly not, of course, the first to translate atheist as Nastika, but I'm using this because it's a famous essay. Reformers and nationalists of all stripes, so from Periyar to Savarkar, had used the word Nastika and its equivalents like in Tamil like Nattikar to mean atheist. Bhagat Singh thus receives the word atheist in the context of reverse translation. He was only 23 when he was executed, and yet he wisely notes in his essay that tearing down blind faith creates a space to construct, I quote, a new philosophy, unquote, and that, I quote, sometimes some material of the old faith may be used for the purpose of reconstruction, unquote. He then frankly states, quote, Let me admit at the very outset that I have not been able to study much on this point. I had a great desire to study the Oriental philosophy, but I could not get any chance or opportunity to do the same, unquote. So he had interesting ideas about how to blend schools of thought and develop what he calls a new philosophy. A parallel example is that of Percy Shelley, who at the age of 18 wrote an essay, The Necessity of Atheism, which got him expelled from Oxford. But having lived on to the advanced age of 29, he did manage to develop a new philosophy. Scholars now agree that Bhagat Singh wrote his essay not in Punjabi or in Urdu, but in English. This makes perfect sense, as the framework of his argument is primarily drawn from Western thinkers. He writes that he studied Bakunin, Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky. The only work that he names is Bakunin's God and the State. And in this work, Bakunin adduces the four main arguments for atheism that Bhagat Singh also puts forward. One, that an omnipresent and benevolent God would not create an imperfect and unjust world. Second, the universality of a belief does not prove its correctness. Third, that religion exists to delude people, especially oppressed people. And fourth, that science explains the world as being made of matter alone. The difference between Bakunin and Bhagat Singh is that Bakunin engages in great detail with Christian theology, and Bhagat Singh does not do this. But Bhagat Singh does state that Christianity and Islam believe that good people will be rewarded in heaven and bad people punished in hell, and he says this is poor consolation for injustice. He mentions Sikhism only once in the essay, quote, I had begun to preserve the unborn, unshorn and unclipped long hair, but I could never believe in the mythology and doctrines of Sikhism or any other religion, unquote. And he mentions Buddhism and Jainism once, but he doesn't engage with them. He does, however, engage with the concept of rebirth, which he names as Hindu. Quote, a God-believing Hindu might be expecting to be reborn as a king, unquote. He views rebirth not as a law of action and consequences, but he instead places it in the Christian framework of a personal God meting out punishments to sinners. I quote, well, you Hindus, you say that all the present sufferers belong to the class of sinners of the previous births. But what is the nature of punishment inflicted by God upon men, even if we suppose them to be offenders? You say he sends them to be born as a cat, a cow, a tree, unquote. Singh asks with regard to his imminent execution, quote, what is the consolation? A God-believing Hindu might be expecting to be reborn as a king. A Muslim or a Christian might dream of the luxuries to be enjoyed in paradise, unquote. Despite having been raised, as he states, under the influence of his grandfather, who he says was an orthodox Arya Samajist, that's his phrase, Singh nowhere mentions the Upanishadic concept of moksha or even the Buddhist and Hindu concept of nirvana. The closest he comes to the concept of self-realization or liberation is his citation of Soham Swami's book, Common Sense. This is the only Indian source that Singh cites for his idea of atheism. He refers to Soham Swami and his student Niralamba Swami's Advaita Vedanta philosophy as only, I quote, only a sort of mystic atheism, unquote. The full title of Soham Swami's book is Common Sense or Ek Atma Vigyan. Ek Atma Vigyan means knowledge of oneself. Bhagat Singh doesn't mention the Sanskrit title. In this book, Swami tries to prove that all religions and ideas of a personal creator God are full of inconsistencies, and realizing the divinity of all beings is the only goal. Soham, the name taken by the author, given name was Shyamakanta Bandhopadhyay, means Soham means I am that, Saha plus Ahem. Soham refers to Atman as non-different from every being. It's an entirely different concept from God as a person-like being creating the world and punishing or rewarding the inhabitants. Soham Swami wrote both in English and in Bengali. In English, he wrote a book-length poem entitled Truth in 1913. This may be the first long Hindu philosophical poem written in English by an Indian. One of his students, Swami Nirvikalpa, states in his preface that, I quote, the irrational belief in an imaginary personal God and the superstitions fostered by it suppress the growth of truth, unquote. In the poem itself, Soham Swami makes statements that sound a lot like Bhagat Singh's statements. I quote, the God whom East and West alike proclaim, I found imposture and an empty name, unquote. He advances standard arguments against the idea of God as omnipotent, unlimited, and benevolent creator, asking why he allows suffering, unrequited love, and death. Quote, his frequent failure, loss, and waste prove him an inexpert, a novice without skill or taste, and not in work alert, unquote. However, he then reaches a standard Advaita conclusion, quote, but Brahm thou art, nor portion nor a part, realized restraining mind, that thou art. Quote, he is on internal quotes, that thou art. So Singh's Why I Am an Atheist is predictably translated in Hindi as Main Nastik Kyun Hu. The primary meaning of Nastik now in Hindi has come to be atheist. The meanings of astik and nastik have changed in Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, Punjabi, Bengali, Telugu, and Tamil to theist and atheist. Wikipedia, the fount of all knowledge, defines nastikta thus. नास्तिकता अथवा नास्तिकवाद या अनीश्वरवाद वो सिद्धांत है जो जगत की सृष्टि करने वाले, उसका संचालन और नियंत्रण करने वाले किसी भी ईश्वर के अस्तित्व को सर्वमान्य प्रमाण के न होने के आधार पर स्वीकार नहीं करता। नास्ति इक्वल टू न प्लस अस्ति इज इक्वल टू नहीं है, अर्थात ईश्वर नहीं है। नास्तिक लोग ईश्वर भगवान के अस्तित्व का स्पष्ट प्रमाण न होने के कारण झूठ करार देते हैं। After providing this incorrect definition and etymology, Wikipedia goes on to give a garbled account of earlier definitions. It even goes so far as to state, वास्तव में न्याय और वेदांत दर्शनों को छोड़कर भारत के अन्य दर्शन सांख्य, योग्य, वैशेषिक, बौद्ध और जैन नास्तिक दर्शन कहे जा सकते हैं, क्योंकि इनमें ईश्वर को सर्जक, पालक और विनाशक नहीं माना गया है। ऐसे नास्तिकों को ही अनीश्वरवादी कहते हैं। So basically its translation is all of these Sankhya, Yoga, Vaisheshika, etc. are Nastic, can be called Nastika philosophies because none of them accepts God as creator, preserver, and destroyer. Thus, a combination of ignorant presentism and modern reverse translation changes an ancient classification of what is a Nastika and a Nastika philosophy. So one may ask, why does this change in meaning matter? Words in any language morph and accumulate new meanings. My response is this is not a case of words organically changing meaning. For example, take the word awe in English, A-W-E, as in awestruck. It's increasingly come to mean enjoyable, as in awesome coffee. That's an actual brand of coffee sold on Amazon. Now, this is an organic change arising from the dwindling of the sense of sublimity and reverence in the Anglophone world. But when meanings change due to reverse translation, entire philosophical frameworks are refitted into a Procrustean bed. This shift in framework happens especially for those who are bilingual, but who read and think primarily in English. And these are the important makers of public opinion. It is significant that the reverse doesn't happen when philosophical concepts are translated both ways. English concepts don't change their meaning. It's well known that dharma has been reduced to duty, or more inaccurately to righteousness, or to the entirely different concept of religion, when one has to fill up a form and put down one's dharma as Muslim or Jain. But the word religion has not changed its meaning, even though dharma is now an English word in the dictionary. Let's take one more example of the mistranslation of dharma and adharma as good and evil in Gita 4:7. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyutthanam adharmasya tadatmanam srijamyaham. In 1994, Isherwood and Prabhavanand, translating for the Vedanta Society, they translate dharma and adharma as goodness and evil, following it up in 4:8 with dushkritam as sin of the sinner. Nikhilananda's translation in the same year, 1944, published in the US, is much more accurate. Whenever there's a decline of dharma, O Bharata, and a rise of adharma, I incarnate myself. For the protection of the good, for the destruction of the wicked, and the establishment of dharma, I am born in every age. Note the use of wicked, not evil. I'll come back to this difference. Despite this early accurate translation, later translations revert to earlier terminology. Juan Mascaro's 1962 translation for Penguin UK again has righteousness, unrighteousness, and evil. Barbara Stoller Minner's 1986 translation, published in the US, has sacred duty for dharma, chaos for adharma, and men who do evil for dushkritam. And these are the two translations most widely used in US classrooms. The Gita Press version, interestingly, first published in 2002 and then reprinted in 2008, reverts to righteousness, unrighteousness, and evildoers. The Norton Critical Edition, published as late as 2012, repeats these words. So Schweig's 2007 translation is the only recent one to retain dharma and adharma. What is at stake in these choices? Is dushkritam the same as evildoers or sinners? The Latin word malum, that is translated as evil, refers to inherent sinfulness and is closely associated with the devil and his acts. The Germanic or Old English word ifel, from which comes the word evil, means bad or wicked, but over time comes to mean something much stronger. Dushta, on the other hand, from the root du, to inflict harm, distress, pain, or sorrow, is related to dukha. And the difference is evident in common usage. A bilingual parent may call a naughty child dushta, but would never call the child evil. As St. Augustine points out, Christianity is a monotheistic religion. Therefore, it cannot accommodate the concept of innate evil. In his Confessions, Augustine narrates how he kept searching for an answer to the question of evil, where did it come from? And he finally realized there is no such thing as evil because everything God created is good. I quote Augustine, It was made clear to me that all things are good even if they are corrupted. Unless they were good, they could not be corrupted. Whatever is good. Evil has no substance at all. If it were a substance, it would be good, unquote. And he distinguishes wickedness from evil, saying wickedness is just a turning away from God. Augustine is, of course, philosophically correct, but most Christians, it's safe to say, are unaware of this and consider evil to be real. This is because Christianity is strongly influenced by the binary thinking of good versus evil, God versus devil. Augustine belonged for 9 years to the Manichaean religion. Manichaeanism was a thoroughgoing dualistic religion founded in Iran by the prophet Mani. From the 3rd to the 7th centuries, it was one of the most widespread religions in the world, and it lingered on till the 14th century. Even though Christianity declared it heretical and stamped it out, Manichaeism's idea that the forces of good and evil, God and the devil, are constantly battling each other within us and also out in the world, this idea left a very strong imprint on Christianity. The morphing of the meaning of evil it can be seen in the 1486 book Malleus Maleficarum, often translated as the Hammer of Witches. Several theologians of the Inquisition criticized this book, but it still sold more copies in Europe till 1678 than any other book besides the Bible. This book recommends the extermination of witches, not their reformation. Before 1400, prosecutions for witchcraft were rare. Witchcraft was viewed as a type of delusion or hallucination. But after this book came the great Renaissance witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. So by its usage of evil to mean a certain thing, this book helped the meaning of the word malum to change from harmful acts to evil acts, done mostly by women in association with the devil. The book actually argues for the inherently evil nature of women, which makes them vulnerable to the devil. Now, Hinduism is a form of radical monism. Monism is the principle that all things are ultimately one, in one way or another. It's even less possible to accommodate the idea of evil in a Hindu framework than in a Christian one. Hindu demons or asura are cousins of the gods, and they are not irredeemably damned like Satan. As analyzed in Gita chapter 16, asura are nothing but greedy and egotistical tyrants. There are almost no poor demons in Hindu narrative. Almost all of them are rich and they seek more wealth and power. Gita chapter 16 describes the demonic. Who are the demonic? People who try to accumulate wealth by unjust means, anyayena artha, boast of their wealth and high birth, think that they can control everyone. Say, yesterday I killed these people, tomorrow I'll kill others, and are therefore consumed by anxiety. Greedy kings like Duryodhana, he's called a Rakshas by Bhishma and by others. Demons have the potential to become good. They are not inherently bad. Vibhishan is an example. Even Duryodhana ends up in the same celestial world as the Pandavas and Krishna. So repeated translation of words like dushta, dharma and adharma and dushta as evil helps develop dushta and adharma as evil helps to develop a polarized view of good and evil. This may be the case for those who are bilingual and think in English, but also by a process of reverse translation, even for those who think in other Indian languages. Adharma may gradually start meaning something closer to evil. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Ruth, Vanita, for that very interesting and engaging session. I thoroughly enjoyed and I learned so much. And perhaps I could request, Professor Trivedi to make some remarks, or shall we just go on to, because there are a couple of questions in the chat box, we can directly go on to the questions, however the chair desires.
I'll say just a word or two. My own experience with this paper is that it was so richly packed that it felt like reading a monograph. And it was so nuanced that I feel like saying mukarrar, please read it out all over again. Because this is so full of subtle meaning that we'll have, when it comes out in print, we'll have to read it once or twice all over. One very small suggestion, Ruth. The word ka in nastika and astika, of course, it means he who believes nasti and asti and so on. At the same time, the word ka is quite ambiguous. Kasmai devaya habisha vidhema. For which God, to which God shall we offer oblation? At the same time, shall we offer oblation to the God called ka? So there is a kind of an ambiguity there, which you may perhaps look at in the very little particle of the phrases nastika and astika. We'll have a real long debate over this paper in private afterwards, but meanwhile, the questions. Yeah.
So the first question here is by Veena Narigal. And she says, very enjoyable, Vanita. Colonial education policy statements made much of what they call translation by double tuition, whereby they meant that what was produced and learned by native students through translations from English to the vernacular could only be tested through translating their learning back into English. Therefore, translation drills being part of the classroom. The paper brings out the costs at which the colonial model of translation based an understanding of language as entities that can be put into relations of direct and more or less exact equivalence. After all, this is a very different model of translation from, say, how it was understood in Darashiko's quote, for instance. Your thoughts on this, perhaps?
There is a phenomenon called back translation where you test whether your translation is correct by translating the whole thing back into the source language. That's not what I'm referring to, because I'm referring to just concepts being translated, just one word being translated over a period of time back and forth and acquiring this new meaning. So it's somewhat different from back translation, which is a translation drill that people do to see if your translation is correct.
There's another question by Hans Harder, who says that the problem is that it is particularly very sentient cultural categories that undergo such processes of reverse translation, initiating a sort of cross cultural ping pong. Take the Varn Jati caste conundrum. And it's like a comment, but I believe he would like you to comment on the same.
Yeah, exactly. Varna and exactly translating Varna and Jati as caste is reducing a very complex phenomenon to a very simplistic, to something entirely rather different. And when I teach, I always try to use the terms Varna and Jati and explain that it's difficult to explain the complexities to an American student. But yeah, it's exactly that kind of translation.
There are a couple of more questions. Shall I read them out? Do we have time?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
we do have
Sakshi, go
time.
ahead, go ahead.
All right, all right. So there's a question by Nandini Kalita, who says, how does the erasure or loss, which is one of the consequences of the phenomena of reverse translation, impact the manner in which we perceive the world?
Yeah, that is what I was trying to sort of point towards. Of course, I don't have an absolute answer. It's a sort of a preliminary inquiry into precisely that when you start thinking of Astika as theist and Nastika as atheist, when you start thinking of Shraddha as faith, I'm not entirely sure. Shraddha is a more complicated, but when you start thinking of Dharma as religion or Dharma as good and versus evil, something has been lost and has something major has shifted and it has been lost, right? So yeah.
There's another question by Nupur Chawla, who says, thank you, Dr. Vanita, for sharing this fascinating idea of how translation changes philosophical meanings and original meanings are often erased. In your talk, you mentioned scriptures and other philosophical texts. Ma'am, could you please help us understand if this idea of reverse translation is also valid in other domains of writing as well, or is it relevant to just a particular kind of literature?
No, as the example was, I mean, we all know that every language has untranslatables. And so, yes, it will affect many things. But I'm not sure. This is now, I haven't thought the whole thing through. But the question of Dharma is a very interesting one, like that story that Javed Akhtar is told, which suggests the way the two meanings coexist, where somebody who has been a peasant who has been converted to Christianity is found feeding a cow, and the padri asks him, "Ay, ab tum ईसाई हो गए हो, तुम गाय को क्यों खिला रहे हो?" And he says, "साहब ईसाई बन गया हूँ, अपना धर्म तो नहीं छोड़ा है." They've changed the religion, but the dharma remains the same. That the two meanings of the word coexist in the consciousness, right? This is really interesting. Yeah.
We also have a comment by Nishad Zaidi ma'am, who says, same is the problem with translation of deen as religion, for it actually refers to justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does it refer to justice even in Deen-e-Ilahi?
Justice of God.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You know, in the first verse of Quran itself, it says Malike Yawmiddin, you know, master of the day of judgment. And for judgment, it's always, you know, the word used is deen. So that is where the, you know, the slip comes.
I'm so glad you brought that in. Now, that's one session in which we have heard Latin, Sanskrit, and now Arabic, apart from Hindi. Wonderful.
There's even Nastik. I mean, if we you brought in that ka part, which I found very interesting, which you know, one really needs to think about. And but if you drop ka part, I mean, Nasti is also, I mean, La ilaha. I mean, almost similar or equivalent to La ilaha. You know?
Aren't you reading a paper, Nishant?
Only learning from scholars like Professor Vanita. Fabulous, fabulous paper. I mean, really, so much to
Absolutely.
read about.
Absolutely.
Very
Yeah.
erudite, as always.
Thank you so much.
I think that our audience are very excited to interact with you, Professor Vanita, because the questions are pouring in, and there is another question by Farah Noor who asks, does the fact that these languages coexist in the subcontinental terrain of historical interactions have a role to play in some of these mistranslations?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of foreign readers versus Indian readers, bilingual readers versus monolingual readers. So when you're translating, say, into English for foreign readers, I think it's fine even if there are some mistranslations. The main purpose is to give them a pleasurable, smooth reading experience so that they can become more acquainted. You can't overload the text with Sanskrit words. I don't agree with doing that. But the problem is when you do the reverse translation into the Indian language, and the Indian words, the Sanskrit word or the Hindi word or the Marathi word starts having a different meaning. That is, and then the bilingual Indian reader has now changed their framework or the mean. That is what I'm interested in. I'm not really interested in the foreign reader has to have an experience of translation, which is going to have some mistranslation in it. That can't be helped, I think.
There's another question by Neeraj P, who says, should we look for another word, a substitute for translation, since it is a problematic term?
Another word for translation. I don't see how that would. I don't think that would help. I mean, unless you want to say mistranslation. It's more like, instead of nastika, use a better word like anishwarvad. I mean, that was actually a better. I wish they had stayed with that. Yeah.
Shall I go on? Shall I pose another question?
Yeah, Sakshi, you can just quickly read out Dr. Jorgen's question and then we can wrap up.
Okay. So the question says, does the notion of reverse translation imply Platonian ideals of translation, that is, of copy and original? In other words, does the process call for a quote unquote conceptual golden age?
That's not what I intended. I just meant you're translating a word into something which it definitely does not mean, and then you're translating it back and giving that completely inaccurate meaning to the first word, when it's very clear that it doesn't mean that. You're saying Sankhya is an Astika philosophy, and now Wikipedia is saying it's a Nastika philosophy on the basis of this complete wrong translation. That's all I meant by reverse translation. So,
but sorry, because now we are just going to wrap up. And I was thinking, but doesn't that happen in all processes of translation? Even if you translate a poem or a story into another language and then try translating it back to the same language, it would be completely different.
And that's what is called back translation. But one only does that as a translation drill to see whether one's translation is accurate. Otherwise, one doesn't do that, right? One doesn't. This process doesn't happen the other way around. When you translate from Hindi into English, as I said, the word religion doesn't change its meaning, even though the word Dharma has now become part of the English dictionary. Religion hasn't changed its meaning and started meaning something more like Dharma. It hasn't. So the language that is more powerful affects the language that is less powerful. It's not an equal process. It's not happening both ways, is what I'm suggesting.
Maybe Professor Trivedi can comment on this, because you translate from Hindi to English and from English to let's say Bangla or some other language. Would the Hindi and the Bangla text be the same?
Hindi and Bangla will be identical. in key terms, there will be the colloquial part is different amongst many Indian languages, but when it comes to nastik, astik, dharma, adharma, as Ruth has pointed out, they are pan-Indian more or less. There are some exceptions. Some languages will not fit into that. Let me not be a pan-imperialist. At the same time, most of them do travel all over. So the problem actually is complicated by English in this whole discussion. And I know that Ruth does not like a word that I absolutely love, the post-colonial, but that is at the root of it. If the conquest, domination in one way then leads to domination and conquest in a number of other ways. And it's part of that package.
But can we say the same about Persian to any Indian language translation?
Well, tomorrow I'm speaking on it for 1 hour at another platform. Yeah. No, we can't say that. We can't say that because during the longer Persian age in India, as compared to the English age so far, I mean, Persian dominated the top power and court for a longer period. At the same time, it did not permeate below because of the levels of literacy and because of the wider gap between the powerful and those who were dominated by the powerful group. There's such a huge gap that there was no way that Persian would cross that gulf. That's what I feel.
Hmm. And there was no Wikipedia and
Just two quick comments from Professor Hans Harder and Dr. Margaret Purno. Professor Harder says, I'd say religion is changing its meaning all the time, a never-ending process. Dr. Purno says, and it was the encounter with other belief systems which changed the meaning of religion. So if anybody would want to comment on that.
Yep. Yes, Ruth?
I just mean that the word religion has not changed into anything closer to the main word dharma, even though dharma is now part of the English, in the way in which dharma has become good and become religion. I don't think it's an equivalent process. Of course, religion is changing on its own, but I don't think the process is equivalent. That's all I mean.
Kashish, do we have?
Yes. Yeah. Now we can end the session, Sakshi.
I think we can end the session. Yeah.
Let the chair wrap up this session.
Yeah. So, Professor Trivedi, any concluding remarks, or can we end the session?
I'm delighted that my student Ruth was in top form. I never failed to be impressed by her ever since the PhD days. Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Trivedi. Thank you, Professor Vanita, for taking out the time. And thank you, Sakshi and Bhawna, for taking up the question answers and the introductions. Thank you, everyone. We'll be breaking for approximately 50 minutes and returning at 7 p.m. IST for the next plenary session where Dr. Preetha Mani and Dr. Sneha Shingvi will be delivering their plenary addresses. So we'll see you in another 50 minutes. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.